So the interesting thing about the debate surrounding biological males and women's sports is that there really isn't any debate at all. You know, a debate involves argument, an exchange of ideas between people of opposing sides on a particular issue. And this requires each side to have some sort of coherent point of view and for them each to present that point of view in a manner that might be intelligible to their opponents. None of that is happening with respect to this issue. The side which favors opening up female sports and locker rooms to males has not bothered to launch any coherent defense of this change or give any good reason for anyone to agree with it, other than to scream empty buzzwords like bigot and transphobes at those who fail to cooperate with them. Carl Sagan liked to say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, it could just as well be said that extraordinary policy proposals require extraordinary justifications. In this case, there is both an extraordinary claim that some males are really women and an extraordinary proposal that biological sex should not be considered as a factor in who gets admitted into women's sports, yet there is nothing approaching extraordinary evidence or extraordinary justification for these assertions. There is not even ordinary evidence and justification. There is nothing. Those who favor putting males in female sports have not bothered to defend their claim at all or to engage with the points raised by the other side. The points on the other side are simple, straightforward, but also powerful. For example, here's author Abigail Schreier testifying before the Senate yesterday about the so-called Equality Act and raising a number of, I think, very pertinent questions. Let's listen.
If your daughter or granddaughter was the top high school tennis player in her state, and then 5 biological boys suddenly decided at the age of 17 to identify as female, should she drop overnight to number 6? Should she lose her college scholarship to a male-bodied athlete who would never have qualified on the boys' team? Does that strike any member of this committee as fair or just? If a woman in your state commits a crime, should she be put in a correctional facility with biological males, some of whom are sex offenders, some of whom may have only begun identifying as female weeks earlier, all of whom could easily overpower her? If a preschool has a policy that only female teachers may accompany little girls to the bathroom, and your daughter's male teacher suddenly identifies as female, ought that teacher to have a legal entitlement to accompany her? Does that strike anyone in this room as safe or sensible?
Those are good questions that need to be answered by the people proposing this stuff, but they won't answer them. They have, again, nothing to offer. So to illustrate my point, let's turn to a recent article in the allegedly reputable publication Scientific American. The piece, written by child psychiatrist Dr. Jack Turbin, titled "Trans Girls Belong on Girls' Sports Teams," claims that there is no scientific case for excluding biological males from female sports. Now, this is certainly extraordinary. No case? It's been thought for millennia that males have biological advantages over women that give them the edge in sports, combat, and other physical contests. Jack Turbin insists that there is no scientific case, not simply a weak case, but no case at all to support this bias. He then spends several thousand words explaining why, except he never does explain why. The actual article itself doesn't prove or even really attempt to prove the opening thesis. Here's what it says instead. The article begins with the lawsuit filed in federal court by the family of 3 girls, cis girls, as the author calls them, in an effort to make biological females seem like but one possible type of girl, one variant. They're suing the Connecticut Association of Schools for allowing boys to compete against girls in track and field. The author, Turbin, attempts to debunk the premise of the lawsuit, writing, quote, "After the Connecticut lawsuit was filed by the cisgender girls' families, one of those girls beat one of the transgender girls named in the lawsuit in a Connecticut state championship. It turns out that when transgender girls play on girls' sports teams, cisgender girls can win. In fact, the vast majority of female athletes are cisgender, as are the vast majority of winners. There's no epidemic of transgender girls dominating female sports. Attempts to force transgender girls to play on the boys' team are unconscionable attacks on already marginalized transgender children, and they don't address a real problem. They're unscientific, and they would cause serious mental health damage to both cisgender and transgender youth." Now, obviously, the fact that some girls can beat some guys in some sports sometimes does not at all prove that boys don't have an inherent advantage. I'm sure there are some blind people who can beat some seeing people in a game of darts, but no sane person would suggest that sight is not an advantage in a contest like that. The point with respect to those male athletes running track in Connecticut is that they were winning gold, silver, and bronze medals with times that would not have qualified them to step onto the track against the men. Against the men, against their fellow males, they were subpar runners. 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th place, or worse. Against the women, they were top competitors. That's the advantage. And this scientific article doesn't so much as try to deal with that fact. It just ignores the fact, as it ignores every other fact. Later on it says, quote, "The notion of transgender girls having an unfair advantage comes from the idea that testosterone causes physical changes such as an increase in muscle mass. But transgender girls are not the only girls with high testosterone levels. An estimated 10% of women have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which results in elevated testosterone levels. They are not banned from female sports. Transgender girls on puberty blockers, on the other hand, have negligible testosterone levels. Yet these state bills would force them to play with the boys. Plus, the athletic advantage conferred by the testosterone is equivocal. As Katrina Karkazi, a senior visiting fellow and expert on testosterone and bioethics at Yale University, explains, studies of testosterone levels in athletics do not show any clear, consistent relationship between testosterone and athletic performance. Sometimes testosterone is associated with better performance, but other studies show weak links or no links. And yet others show testosterone is associated with worse performance. The bill's premise lacks scientific validity." Okay. Now, even if I were to simply accept this ridiculous claim that testosterone doesn't give you an advantage, or even it's a disadvantage in a physical sport, and even if I were to pretend that there's some relevance to the minority of women with an ovarian condition that gives them more of the hormone, even if I were to accept all of that, and even if I were to pretend again, for the sake of this argument, which he wants us to pretend, that all of the male athletes competing against women are on puberty blockers, which is not true, well, let's just give him all of that. It still would not come close to proving the case that men have no physical advantage over women in sports. Testosterone is but one factor. One. As an article in Live Science in 2017 noted, an article that would probably not be published today, men, along with having up to 20 times more testosterone than women, also have greater muscle mass, larger fast-twitch muscle fibers, larger lungs, larger hearts, longer legs, smaller waists, less body fat. And this is but a partial list. All of these physical factors give men a distinct, profound, significant physical advantage. This is why all of the fastest and strongest people in the world are men. This is why there is no state in the union where the top female runners have, on average, faster times than the top male runners. This is why a decent male high school basketball player could walk into the WNBA and dominate without having to try that hard. It all comes back to physiology. And this article, which is supposed to be providing a thorough scientific case for allowing males in women's sports, does not deal with any of these physiological factors. Those two paragraphs that I read are the extent of the scientific case presented. From there, his argument revolves solely around the feelings of trans athletes, claiming that it will be emotionally painful for some men if they're not allowed to compete against women. But this is negated by the fact that it's emotionally painful for women to have their privacy and athletic opportunities stolen by men. At a minimum, we have an emotional wash, right? A stalemate, with both sides making emotional claims. Now, in reality, the emotions of the men are far outweighed by the women, both because there are a lot more women affected and because the emotional demands of the men are far more unreasonable than that of the women. But even if we pretend again that it's an even emotional match, still we are left having to fall back on the scientific argument. As far as that goes, as we have seen, the other side really has no scientific argument at all, which doesn't stop them from publishing in something called Scientific American. And so that's why the author of this article is canceled. And anyone who reads that article, or at least reads the headline, which is what most people will do and what they're counting on you doing, and is simply persuaded that, well, the article says it in the headline, it's in something called the Scientific American, they must have a scientific case. Anyone dumb enough to do that, and I fear there are millions of them, also canceled. Hey, listen, hit the subscribe button. Do it right now. I demand it. And I thank you for your compliance. It is somewhat appreciated.